welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie, and for those of you who are new to this channel, this is a channel where I read through all of the unread books on my bookshelf until we reach 0. Today I want to talk to you about this channel and the concept for it and where we are, because unbeknownst to me and very quietly, this channel has passed its full year mark on here on Booktube. And I wanted to have a look at the original conception of this channel, where we are in terms of this little project of mine, and whether the rules I had set for myself are still working. So some of you might have watched my first video on this channel, but if you haven't, I essentially explain how we got to this situation. So this channel, Julie Reads Her Bookshelf, started basically as kind of an accountability mechanism for myself. At the end of last year, I went through all of the unread books on my bookshelf and I counted them. And it was a horrifying experience to go through, because I had known throughout COVID in particular that I was buying more books than I could possibly read. And I had an idea that the number was getting too high, but I did not know exactly how high that was. So actually counting each and every unread book that I had was a brutal experience. And in the end, I counted 90 books that were unread on my bookshelf. Now, when I say 90, I'm talking 90 physical books and 90 books in the English language, because I also read in Chinese and less proficiently in French, and both of those languages I only have about 2 or 3 books that are unread, so they're not a problem for me. It's the English language books that I just keep buying and I can't seem to stop myself. And so when I actually did the tally and I looked at how many books that are unread, for me that was a number that was too high. Now everyone has their own standard for what is too many books that are unread on their physical TBR. For me, I read about 30 books a year. That's not a very high number for Booktube, certainly, but it's all that I can manage because in addition to doing this, I have a day job. I work as a lawyer and I work very, very long hours. So of the time that I can spare out of my work day, my work week to read for pleasure, I get through about 30 books a year. So 90 books is about 3 years worth of reading. And so if I kept buying, I knew that this problem would just get worse and worse and worse. So something had to happen. And I thought, you know what, this is a great concept for a Booktube channel. So I started this channel essentially to keep myself publicly accountable for getting through all of the unread books on my bookshelf. And the dream, the end goal, is to get to 0. So at the start of this channel, I set myself a number of exceptions so that I am not completely cut off from buying books. It's just that I can only buy books in certain very limited circumstances. And I was a little bit worried that by giving myself these exceptions, that as a person who exploit loopholes for a living, I would just exploit my own loopholes. But actually, it's turned out okay. So let's have a look at these exceptions. The first exception is that for every 20 books I read, I'm allowed to buy 1 book. And so when I did get through 20 books on my physical TBR, I bought a book. And that book, and I showed this in my last video, I think, was Moby Dick. And I bought it in my favorite editions, which is the Reader's Digest for I think it's called World's Best Reading series. And these are a series of subscriptions that Reader's Digest did, not digested versions of novels, but full novels. And they're beautifully printed in hardback form, and they've got illustrations and just a wonderful object in itself. So these are one of my favorite editions to own. I have quite a few of them behind me here. And so when I did get through my first 20 books off my physical TBR, I gave myself the reward that I was allowed to get, and I bought Moby Dick. The second exception I gave myself was that I was still allowed to buy foreign language books. Now, as I said, I only really have about 2 or 3 Chinese or French language books at any given time. And for me, it's really important for me to keep up reading in those languages because foreign languages are kind of a skill that atrophies if you don't use it. And for me, having been born a Chinese speaker, and having studied French most of my life, it's really important for me to keep up those skills. So I set myself a goal every year to read at least 1 book in Chinese and at least 1 book in French. And so when I travel to those countries, I do want to be able to buy books in those languages because it's actually quite expensive to buy foreign language books in Australia. So while I was in China this year, I bought Golden Times by Wang Xiaobo, which is kind of a modern Chinese classic. The author Wang Xiaobo died pretty young, but this was one of his kind of best known works. And I really wanted to be able to read a modern Chinese classic, something written by a more contemporary Chinese author. So I haven't read this yet, but it's pretty high up on the list for my one Chinese book to read next year. The third exception I gave myself is that I was allowed to buy coffee table books, art books, and cookbooks. And the reason for this exception is fairly logical. These are not books that are meant to be read. They're meant to be flicked through, and in the case of a cookbook, they're meant to be used. So they're quite functional items. And I did buy 1 cookbook last year, and that is Fuchsia Dunlop's Land of Fish and Rice. And this is an absolutely brilliant food cookbook about the food and cuisine from a specific area of China known as the Golden Delta. So that's the area in between 3 cities of Hangzhou, Suzhou, and Shanghai, kind of along the eastern coast of China. And Fuchsia Dunlop is such a good food writer. She writes with so much knowledge and appreciation of regional differences, which I find is very rare. People tend to think of Chinese cuisine as this kind of monolithic entity, whereas in China, the cuisine differs quite a lot depending on where you go. And that's the same with, Indian food and the food in a lot of different places around the world, Italian food as well. And I really appreciate food writers who can really get into a specific region and look at the produce from that region, look at the climate in that region and how that's influenced cuisine, and come up with some beautiful, beautiful recipes. So I really liked this book, and I've cooked a few things from it. So if you are in the market for a Chinese cookbook, absolutely recommend this one. In terms of coffee table books, I got one this year, which is 700 Penguins. I think I've talked about this before. It's literally, there's nothing to read whatsoever. It's literally just a book of 700 penguin covers, and they are so retro, so fabulous, and I really enjoy kind of flicking through them. And I put this on my coffee table, and when I have visitors, a lot of my visitors like to kind of have a bit of a flick through as well to see, what kind of retro covers Penguin used to print. So I quite enjoy having this one. And the other one, which I got as a gift, is a Pocket RBG Wisdom. As I said, I'm a lawyer, so a lot of my friends, when they see kind of legal souvenirs as they travel, they tend to buy for me. So a friend of mine went to the States this year, and she got this for me as a little gift, and I have that on my coffee table as well. The fourth exception to my book buying ban is that I'm allowed to buy a book when I travel. And so one of the really enjoyable things about traveling for me is actually visiting the local bookshops and buying books by local writers. And so I did buy a couple of books this year while I was traveling. In the beginning of the year, I went up to Darwin in the Northern Territory here in Australia, and I was there actually for work, but I was there working with some Indigenous clients, and I bought this book, Black Lives, White Law, Locked Up and Locked Out in Australia by Russell Marks. And so this is a book about Indigenous incarceration in Australia and why Indigenous people became one of the most incarcerated populations on this planet. And it really talks about some fundamental structural issues I'm really disappointed about the results of our referendum here in Australia, which failed. We did not end up passing the referendum to give Indigenous people a voice to our parliament, and I think that's a real shame. But this book, regardless of what anyone's opinion is on the referendum, this book is really important about what we actually need to do structurally to make sure that we stop incarcerating Indigenous people in this country, because it is a real shame. It's something that is really, really awful about the history and the current social problems that in this particular country, and I think it's important that everyone becomes aware of it. So if you are interested in Australian Indigenous history, and in particular why Indigenous people have ended up being so marginalised and so incarcerated here, this is a really good starter book for that. The other book I bought while I was traveling was The Time Regulation Institute by Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar. I already talked about this book a little bit. I bought it while I was in Turkey back in September. And because I've already made a video about that, I won't go into too much detail. But again, it's one of those things where it's a real pleasure for me when I'm in a country to find out who the local writers are and to read a little bit more about it. And in this case, I didn't know a lot about Turkish literature, so I'm very, very happy to have bought this, and it being a Penguin Modern Classic just made my day. Now, in addition to those exceptions, there are kind of two other parameters that I've set myself. The first one is that I will unhaul books if required or necessary. I'm not going to force myself to read every single book on my bookshelf if they don't appeal to me for whatever reason. Now, before I started this project, I did do a very light cull of my bookshelf. So I think I got rid of maybe 4 or 5 books off it. So of the 90 books that I started off with, most of them I was pretty sure I wanted to read. Now, in the first year of doing this, I have not unhauled any books, but there is one book in particular that I'm sort of a bit tossing up between unhauling or keeping, and that is Far From the Madding Crowds by Thomas Hardy. I read 2 Thomas Hardy books this year. I read Jude the Obscure and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and I can't say I enjoyed either of them. I can't say I enjoy Thomas Hardy. So there is a part of me that's thinking, well, do I really want to keep going with this author that I don't think I enjoy? Do I want to read a 3rd book by him? Having said that, a lot of people tell me that Far From the Madding Crowd is their favourite Hardy. So I also want to give an author a fair chance before I just give up on them wholesale. So I'm a bit on the fence about whether or not I keep going with Thomas Hardy, and in particular, whether I would unhaul my copy of Far From the Madding Crowd, which is still currently part of my physical TBR. But it's very close to the chopping block, let's just put it that way. And the final rule that I set myself in this project is that anthologies, collected volumes, omnibus editions of books count as read if I've read one whole work out of it. And the reason for this rule is I actually have a lot of collected volumes of works by certain authors. And because I live in a very small apartment, and the shelf you see behind me is actually my main bookshelf. So I try to conserve real estate by buying collected volumes, which are kind of, you've got the one book and it might be a bit larger, but it contains 7 or 8 works by the same author, and I don't have to keep buying individual volumes. I think they're a great deal usually, and they help conserve the very limited real estate that I have on my bookshelf. And the best example I've got for that is a book that I read in November, which is The White Album by Joan Didion. That comes out of this collected volume that's published by Everyman's Library of, I think, 7 of Joan Didion's works. Because I read one full book out of this collected volume, I'm quite happy to count it as read, and I do intend to come back to the remaining volume eventually. So there you have it. That's my first year on Booktube and my first year of doing this unread shelf project. I started off with 90 books. As at the time of recording, I have 65 books on my bookshelf that are unread. I'm pretty happy with the progress, but I have come to a few realizations. And the first is that it's going to take me longer than 3 years. When I first started this project, I thought, I read 30 books a year, and I have 90 unread books, so it's going to take me 3 years to get through all of it. That's the rough time frame that I had in mind this time last year. I've realized that that's not going to happen. There's a few reasons for it. The first is that all of my unread books are unread for a reason. And that's because quite often they are the denser classics, the mammoths, the books that are hard to get through that I keep passing over whenever I go and pick out a book on my bookshelf. So as we get through more and more of my unread bookshelf, I'm going to get to harder and harder books. Case in point, this year, I didn't read that many books this year, but so many of them were Victorian era classics that were over 800 pages long. And so if I'm not reading 30 books in a year, or if I'm not reading, 35 books off my bookshelf in a calendar year, I'm okay with that, because the quality of my reading is going to get higher and higher as I get to the harder books on my unread bookshelf. So that's fine by me. The other thing that I realized while I've been reading through my unread shelf this year is that it's going to be really unsustainable for me to read exclusively from my bookshelf. And you'll see throughout the year that I've used library books and less so ebooks this year, but I do read ebooks. So my plan is to use library books and ebooks on my Kindle to try and bring more variety to my reading, because if I'm going to be reading denser and bigger books behind me, I want to be able to occasionally bring some levity and froth to my reading through getting books from the library or through getting ebooks on my Kindle. And I don't tend to have a problem with getting sort of hoarding Kindle books. I tend to just buy one and read it straight away. So as I'm not reading exclusively off my unread physical bookshelf, it's going to take me a bit longer, because the 30 books that I read in a year aren't all going to be coming from the shelf behind me. They're going to come from a mix of my physical TBR and a couple of books from the local library, a couple of books on my Kindle. So I'm okay with that. No one is forcing me to do this. I'm doing this entirely voluntarily, and hopefully in about 4 years, I will get to 0 on my bookshelf. So speed and progress issues aside, this project has been absolutely worth it for me after 1 year. One of the main reflections that I take away from my sort of book no-buy year, even though it's not been a real no-buy year, as you can see, but one of the things that I really take away from this year is the fact that buying less books has made me appreciate buying books a lot more. I've really felt this sense of kind of joy and thrill every time I allowed myself to buy a book this year within sort of the rules and the parameters I've set myself, because psychologically it feels like a real treat. It feels like if I've read 20 books, it feels like a reward that I'm giving myself. If I'm traveling and I'm looking for a book to buy on my travels, I really make sure that the book is worthwhile, that it's representative of the trip. And so that when I pick up a book that I bought on my travels, such as, the Time Regulation Institute, I really feel a sense of joy and memory associated with it. And by being more careful and intentional with the choices that I make around book buying, that has been a real source of joy for me this year, rather than these sort of endless book hauls and books that I put on my bookshelf and I immediately forget about, and they sit unread on my bookshelf for years and years. I don't have that sense of guilt anymore with the unread books on my bookshelf. I'm getting through them slowly but surely, and every time I'm making a choice to buy a book, I'm making such a conscious and careful choice that it has been just a real source of happiness in my life. So that's been the biggest reward, ironically, from a year of not really buying books, which is that whenever I do buy books, I appreciate them so much more. So thank you so much for watching, subscribing, leaving comments, and just generally supporting me over the past year. This is not a big booktube channel by any stretch of the imagination. I've sort of just let it run naturally, and I'm happy that I did that. I feel like by not going out and chasing algorithms or trying to game the system, what I do have is, with the few of you that I subscribed, a really lovely relationship. I really enjoy following many of you on Booktube, and I'm really happy to receive the words of encouragement from all of you as well. And I really hope that by the end of next year we will have more happy news to report. And here's to a really, really great 2024. Merry Christmas to those of you who celebrated. And I will probably see you very soon, since I'm on a break from work at the moment. So I'll be making a few more videos about my plans for 2024 coming up. Thank you, Booktube.